going to continue with Dr. Christoper Jain Miller. He's a professor here at in Arihanta Institute, and his paper today is called Engage Jain Yoga, Listening for Hatha Yoga and Struck Sound, hata-na in Acharya Sushil Kumar's Song of the Soul. So, Chris, we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you so much, Alba. And it's great to follow such a great colleague as Corinna in presenting here. So you've heard the title of my paper, here it is, and I am just going to get right into it. If my screen will advance, there we go. Okay, so why anahata nada? I am really interested in this question for similar reasons as Corinna. And I first actually encountered this practice at Polestar Gardens on the Big Island of Hawaii when I used to live in Hawaii. I was there in a community that was based on Yogananda's Kriya Yoga tradition, where listening for the internal unstruck sound, anahata nada, is a key component of their meditation practice. You can see them pictured down here below. And I wrote about this in one of the chapters of my book, Embodying Transnational Yoga, because I found it so fascinating that not only did they use the harmonium, as we might expect, but they also used the ukulele, guitars, and other instruments that came together to create a really wonderful, beautiful ensemble of music, mantra, and sacred sound that eventually led to listening for an unstruck sound within oneself. I traced some of the origins of this practice back to Shangadeva's Sangita Ratnakara, which, as far as I was able to find, is the first articulation of this notion of connecting external sound to an internal unstruck sound within. So I found it fascinating that this was happening in Hawaii in this yoga community, and that we're doing it out there on Beach 69, as you see here in Kona, and then going for a surf afterwards, and all these different entanglements of culture that were there. This raised the question for me, however, of how else has this practice been adapted in contemporary yoga? And so my research question that's driving the research here in this initial look at Acharya Sushil Kumar's Song of the Soul is that Acharya Sushil Kumar says he is teaching Jain Yoga through his Arham Yoga, involving the practice of the Namokar Mantra. So we heard about Acharya Sushil Kumar from Parveen. I'm going to talk about what he means when he says we're practicing Jain Yoga. And what we're really going to see is that Jain Yoga, as we've seen with Corinna's presentation as well, is constantly changing to adapt to the various practices and theories that are going on around it. So I'm going to look at one aspect of Acharya Sushil Kumar's teachings on mantra and sacred sound here, anahata nada, this unstruck sound. And I'm going to show how Kumar is combining medieval Jain yoga with other influence, including the Vedas, Tantra, Hatha Yoga, Sanskrit grammarians, and Advaita Vedanta. And all of this is coming together to what I'm calling engaged Jain yoga. And I've used this term before. I'm using it based on the book that you are the first ones to see publicly, actually, here, the cover of our book, Engaged Jainism, where we follow an engaged Jain studies methodology. And what we mean by this is that, as you see here in the quote, as Jain principles and traditions are applied within specific cultural circumstances, the Jain tradition is transformed in particular ways, but so too is the cultural context. And what I mean to say by that is that the yoga tradition of the Jain tradition, or yoga traditions, as they move into different circumstances and cultural circumstances, it's going to be changed and transformed. It's going to adapt, and it's also at the same time going to transform the context around it. So let's see how this happens in Acharya Sushil Kumar's work. So here's some of the research data, things you would probably want to know. So Acharya Sushil Kumar was born in 1926 into a Hindu Brahmin family. He had a spiritual calling at a very young age. He left his family to live with a Jain monk, Muni Chotilal, who became his guru. He, of course, studied Sanskrit. He also studied Jain texts. And so he's getting into the Jain tradition, even though he's born into a Hindu Brahmin family. And he began to practice Namokar Mantra, a mantra that is chanted by Jains all around the world, all the way to this day. And from this developed what he calls Arham Yoga, based on his own experiences and his studies. He had a spiritual vision of a deceased Muni, who you see pictured here next to him in the image, Muni Rupchandji, who he said taught him Jain philosophy and guided him to become a monk. He then had initiation at the age of 15 and took Diksha in the Jain Stanakavasi sect. And after all of his training, he began to promote Jain philosophy. He's famous for traveling outside of India to promote Jain philosophy, specifically in North America. And he's famous for that because all monks and nuns are expected to stay in India, travel by foot, and not travel by plane. But he found it so important to spread the message of nonviolence and compassion around the world that he left India and became the first monk outside of India to retain that status in the eyes of his followers. His legacy is also that he's one of the founders of the VHP, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. He's spoken at the UN in many international venues, and perhaps most famously established Siddha Chalam in New Jersey, of which I will show you an image at the end. I want to go now into one case study of many that we could in this text, Song of the Soul, wherein Acharya Sushil Kumar is telling us how Namokar Mantra, which you see pictured here, leads us to the unstruck sound, this hata-na, in his book, Song of the Soul. You're going to see images of text from his book here on the right side of the screen in blue. And on the left, I'm going to show green text that's going to show where some of this stuff is coming from. So in Song of the Soul, Acharya Sushil Kumar situates his unstruck sound within 4 levels of sound that you see here in red: Vaikari, Madhyama, Pashyanti, and Para. You see, unstruck sound is a subtle inner vibration. It falls into category number 2 there, Madhyama, which is just below the level of gross speech, which is like my voice, which you hear right now. Where's he getting this from? As I've gone through Jain texts and tried to identify sources for where he could be getting a lot of this, I of course went to the Yoga Shastra, which he quotes in other parts of his text, and found that there is something similar to this subtilization of sound that happens in verse 8.9, which you see here in green. You can see there's a voiced long syllable, a protracted syllable, a subtle and afterwards even more subtle sound, adi sukshmam. You also can see that these terms are not the same as Vaikari, Madhyama, Pashyanti, and Para that we have here in Acharya Sushil Kumar's Song of the Soul, but they map onto that subtilization process of going from gross sound to subtle sound. We do, however, find more explicit mentions of this kind of theory of sound in the Vedas, for example. 4 are the definite grades of speech. Men speak the 4th grade of speech, as it says in the Rig Veda, referring to actually what he has as number 1, Vaikari, the grossest form of sound. We also find it in the 5th century Vakyapadiya by Bhartrhari, where these first 3 levels of sound at least are mentioned explicitly: Vaikari, Madhyama, and Pashyanti. And Para, although it's not explicitly mentioned by Bhartrhari, is a transcendent form of sound that is theorized in other lists of 4 that come after him. So that's coming out of a grammatical text that is not of the Jain tradition. So I want to reference here is that these references to subtle levels of sound are found outside of the Jain tradition very explicitly. And it makes sense because he was born into a Hindu Brahmin family. Now, there are other aspects of the unstruck sound in Song of the Soul, and we see that it's framed within the raising of Kundalini and the concentration of pranic energy. We see here in red, anahata nadam, or the unstruck sound, emerges. It can be heard. We see here the Sushumna path. We see him talking about Kundalini, piercing the Brahma Granthi, Vishnu Granthi, and the Rudra Granthi. And we also see underlined here 3 different chakras: the Muladhara chakra, the heart chakra, and the third eye center. Now, if I go into Jain texts, as far as what's available, I don't find reference to these particular practices in the way that they are articulated here. There are things that come close, of course, in the Yoga Shastra. There is a notion of splitting open the knots, the granthi, this very subtle sound moving through a middle path. That sounds very much like the granthis that we have here. It sounds very much like an unstruck sound, the subtle sound, the susukshma dvani, and also this middle path, the madhya marga. But these are not the same terms, right? They're not the same. Where might they be coming from? Where might he be drawing them from? Let me start with Brahma Granthi and Vishnu Granthi. We, of course, find these, as we saw in Corinna's wonderful presentation, we find these references and others in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. And here I'm citing James Mallinson and his team's translation of that to show how some of these practices that are in Song of the Soul actually map quite nicely or perhaps have some of their sources in Hatha Yoga texts. So here you see in Hatha Yoga Pratipika 4.17, the piercing of the knot of Brahma, which in the void an unstruck sound will be heard in the body. And also in Amarauga, in perhaps the 12th century before Hatha Yoga Pratipika, we see the Vishnu Granthi, the piercing of the knot of Vishnu. And we can see that these ideas of piercing these knots, while not in Jain texts, are clearly in these Hatha Yoga texts. The Rudra Granthi as well comes in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and other texts. Rudra's knot, as you see it here from that same translation that I mentioned before, is also an aspect of the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. There's also mention here, interestingly, as you see at the top in red, that when the kundalini, this concentrated pranic energy, moves upward, it leads to this listening and hearing of this internal sound, unstruck sound. Where is that coming from? I first want to point out something that Mallinson pointed out back in 2012 that I found fascinating when I first started teaching Hatha Yoga in my graduate seminars. And that is that this notion of the Shaiva and Bindu models being conflated on top of one another in pre-modern Hatha Yoga texts, such as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. So here you have the Shaiva model of raising Kundalini, and you have the ascetic kind of Bindu model of retaining semen in the cranial vault that we heard Corinna mention before when she mentioned Bindu. And these two models of the yogic body, which are not the same and come from different strands of practice, are being conflated, as Mallinson points out, in texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. I think there's something similar taking place in Song of the Soul, where we see the conflation, once again, of these models of the body. And I think it's important to understand this history to see how it's moving into modern yoga, because this happens quite often. Another interesting thing is that chakras are only mentioned cursorily, mentioned at least in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. They're not a main feature. For example, Muladhara, heart chakra, and third eye center, which are mentioned here in Song of the Soul, I think can be more accurately traced back, not to Hatha Yoga, but as Mallinson and Singleton have shown, for example, in some of their work in Roots of Yoga, to the Kubjika, Mata Tantra, and of course to the Shat Chakra Nirupana, these texts coming from the 10th or 16th centuries. The Shat Chakra Nirupana, the one you see pictured here, this serpent power one, we've probably all read, many of us have read, translated by Arthur Avalon, was made possible and due to the colonial encounter and the Orientalist encounters in India, through which that text was translated and democratized in English and available to a wide audience. Acharya Sushil Kumar's audience would probably know it. And that's probably, or at least some of the sources of where he's drawing these chakra systems from in Song of the Soul. Another interesting feature, and this is from some correspondence with Corinna that I've had, is that chakras are abandoned in Jain Yoga. And she's written this for me. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read you what's highlighted. So we see chakras showing up in Song of the Soul, but strictly speaking, there are no Jain Hatha Yoga texts, including Kundalini, chakras, and the subtle body. In the Yoga Pradipa, which Corinna just gave us some examples from, chakras are entirely absent except for a warning. If such terms appear at all, they are metaphorical and not part of an energetic body map in Jain texts. Therefore, steering clear of the body-based or power-generating practices like those found in not Hatha Yoga and other forms of Tantra, we might say. So Corinna, thank you for confirming that for me. I had to reach out to Corinna as I was going through this to see if I was missing something, but as far as I know now, I'm not. In fact, here in the Yoga Pradipa, and I thank Corinna for sharing this with me, we have this verse 15 that says, Shat Chakra Tyaktva, the 6 chakras should be abandoned, right? So the translation from Corinna here is the ones wishing for liberation should abandon everything such as the 6 chakras. A couple final points I'll point out here about the text, Song of the Soul, is that it includes the practice of Shanmukhi Mudra, which you see the image of at the bottom here from the text itself, as something that can help people listen for this unstruck sound within. And it will help this inner sound emerge. Those who need help and cannot sit still enough or practice well enough to be able to do it, this Shanmukhi Mudra can help them. Where does Shanmukhi Mudra come from? I have not seen it in a Jain text, so I started to get curious to try to understand where it may have been practiced. Vasudeva points out, and I think this is the first instance of it, is that it comes up in the Svachandra Tantra as Shanmukhi Karana, a similar practice. And it also emerges later as the Hatha Pradipika online has pointed out in the Shiva Samhita in 5.36 and through 5.46, where it teaches a similar practice. And so what I'm trying to make clear here is that this practice as well has its sources in Hatha Yoga texts that also have their sources in tantric influences. And here it's described in Svachanda Tantra. It says, assuming the karana of the 6 orifices, one should contemplate the deity Sada Shiva. One should seal both ears with the 2 thumbs, the 2 eyes with the index and middle fingers in order, and with the remaining fingers, the 2 orifices of the nose. The mind, verily, should be fixed on the 6 openings, the Shanmukha. So here we have something akin to Shanmukhi Mudra in a tantric text. Finally, there are various sounds that Acharya Sushil Kumar says in Song of the Soul will emerge that include the following: thunder, the ocean, waterfall, drum, flute, bells, wind, cymbal, string instrument, conch shells, crickets, hummingbees, and others as well. And there the chapter ends on listening for these unstruck sounds. Those who have studied Hatha Yoga texts will recognize that although there are some examples in Jain texts, here's buzzing of bees. This is also from Corinna's course that was just shared in the chat. The poet Dhyanatre from the 17th century also mentioned sounds, the buzzing of bees. We probably recognize this list of sounds more accurately from texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, where below me here, I've highlighted from verses 4.37 through 4.39, or I've put them in bold, the terms that match either exactly or very closely to the ones that Acharya Sushil Kumar is including in Song of the Soul. So what does this all mean? I'm going to conclude here soon and try to understand how this is all coming together. So before Acharya Sushil Kumar, Hemachandra was also assembling Jain and Tantric practices into a coherent Jain doctrine. We've seen that. We saw a little bit of it in Corinna's work as well in the Yoga Pradipa. There's a demonstration of this Jain ingenuity in Jain Yoga of adapting practices from outside of the tradition. Of course they are. They're engaging with others, other religious traditions, tantric traditions of their time, the Buddhists, as well as the Shaivas and other Hindus. So what we see taking place here is Jains like Hemachandra, the author of the Yoga Pradipa, and others are adapting these practices and assembling them in their medieval period to nevertheless retain a commitment to their karma theory and the need to purify the soul. That's not something new. That's something we already know, right? We also know that the techniques of Hatha Yoga were being democratized across sectarian lines during this late medieval period especially. Mounson, in that same article I mentioned before, pointed out that this is creating a kind of universality as a broad feature of Hatha Yoga, not belonging to any one tradition, but the Hatha Yoga Pradipikas, as he writes, blanket agglomeration of the various techniques of Hatha Yoga and Laya Yoga creates a somewhat incoherent whole. One of the things I love about the article is that it traces the origins of many of the verses in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika to other Hatha Yoga and Tantric texts that preceded it. And so you can really see, although the Swatmarama, the author of Hatha Pradipika, doesn't provide citations for where he's getting his information from to write the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, it's actually kind of a copy and paste of a number of different texts and practices into one text where multiple subtle body models are mapped onto one another and overlap with one another. And it creates this kind of universal and yet incoherent whole that all comes together. And I'm experiencing, as I read through Song of the Soul, there's a kind of, none of the citations are there. I'm having to go back into the Vedas. I'm looking at Bhartahari. I'm looking at other texts, tantric texts, trying to determine what some of the origins of these practices are as they come together. And I think for that reason, Song of the Soul really represents a really interesting and wonderful case study of Jain Yoga in the contemporary period that has ties back to these things that were happening during the medieval period and even before. And finally, my last slide, Alba, I think I'll be on time. Acharya Sushil Kumar, this is a discontinuity with the past. Acharya Sushil Kumar was speaking to a totally different audience. He was talking to a new Hindu diaspora and Jain diaspora, as well as those who were born in America, who would have more readily recognized his references, of course, to popular Vedic, grammatical, tantric, and especially Hatha Yoga texts, like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, that they would have had access to or would have some knowledge of at least, whereas they didn't have any access to or knowledge necessarily of Jain text. And from this, he's created this new form of yoga at Siddhachalam, which you see pictured here below me, as I promised, this Arham yoga. And this is what I'm calling engaged Jain yoga. His yoga has clearly been transformed by all of these influences and more that I haven't had time to go into here. And at the same time, Siddhachalam is still there. It's still transforming people's lives. People are still practicing yoga there. I know Parveen is a practitioner of yoga as well. I'm a practitioner of yoga as well. And it transforms, as we all know, the person who is practicing in some sort of powerful way. So I'll leave it there. And I thank you all for your attention. Over to you, Alba.